The snow fell like tears from a grieving sky as General George Washington stared across the ice-choked Delaware River. On the night of December 25th, 1776, behind him, the Continental Army huddled in tattered coats, their bare feet leaving bloody prints in the snow. The Revolution hung by a thread so thin that even the gentlest breeze might snap it forever. Washington's weathered hands trembled as he gripped the letter from Congress. The enlistments of his soldiers would expire at 6 days on January 1st, 1777. Without a victory, without hope, these brave men would simply walk away, leaving the dream of independence to die in the frozen wasteland of New Jersey. The British-controlled New York, Philadelphia lay vulnerable, and Hessian mercenaries occupied the strategic town of Trenton just across the river. The general's aide, Colonel Alexander Hamilton, approached through the swirling snow. "Sir, the men are asking if we'll attempt the crossing tonight." His young voice carried the weight of a nation's desperate gamble. Washington nodded grimly. They had no choice. This Christmas night would either herald the birth of liberty or witness its funeral dawn as darkness deepened. Washington's army began their perilous journey across the Delaware. Ice chunks battered the Durham boats while soldiers fought to keep their powder dry and their muskets functional. The bitter wind cut through their thin uniforms like sabers, and several men collapsed from exposure before reaching the New Jersey shore. By dawn on December 26th, they had achieved the impossible: a surprise attack on Trenton that captured nearly 1,000 Hessian prisoners and restored hope to the faltering cause. But Washington knew the single victory, while crucial, was not enough. The British would respond with overwhelming force, and his position remained precarious. The captured Hessian commander, Colonel Johann Rall, lay dying from his wounds as he was brought before Washington. Through labored breaths, he warned the American general, "You have won today, but General Cornwallis comes with 8,000 men. You cannot hold this position." These words echoed in Washington's mind as he contemplated his next move. Intelligence reports confirmed Rall's warning. Lieutenant General Charles Cornwallis was indeed marching south from New York with a massive force, determined to crush this colonial rebellion once and for all. The British had grown tired of these upstart Americans and their dreams of independence. They would show no mercy this time. Washington gathered his senior officers in the Trenton barracks as the new year approached. The room fell silent as he outlined their desperate situation. They could not retreat back across the Delaware. The ice was breaking up, making crossing impossible. They could not remain in Trenton. Cornwallis would overwhelm them with superior numbers. The only option was audacious beyond belief. They would attack. The plan that emerged from that smoky room would either secure American independence or ensure its complete destruction. They would feint toward Princeton, drawing Cornwallis away from his supply lines and reinforcements. It was a gamble that required perfect timing, unwavering courage, and more than a little divine providence. As Washington dismissed his officers to prepare for what might be their final battle, he reflected on the weight of destiny resting upon their shoulders. The fate of millions yet unborn hung in the balance, and everything would be decided in the coming days on the frozen fields of New Jersey. The morning of January 2nd, 1777, dawned with an ominous silence that seemed to muffle even the sound of breathing. General Washington stood before his assembled officers in the dim candlelight of the Trenton meeting house, his blue-gray eyes reflecting the gravity of their situation. Outside, British advance scouts had been spotted moving through the frozen countryside, harbingers of the approaching storm. Colonel Nathanael Greene, his most trusted field commander, spread a crude map across the wooden table. "Sir, our spies report Cornwallis has reached Princeton with the main body of his army. He's positioning his forces for a direct assault on our positions here in Trenton." Greene's finger traced the enemy's likely approach routes, each one spelling potential doom for the Continental Army. Washington studied the map intently, his strategic mind working through possibilities like a chess master contemplating his next move. The British advantage was overwhelming: 8,000 seasoned regulars against his ragtag force of fewer than 5,000, many of whom were militia with limited training and questionable resolve. Conventional military wisdom dictated immediate retreat, but Washington had learned that conventional wisdom would not win this war. "Gentlemen," Washington began, his voice carrying the authority that had held this army together through months of defeat and despair, "we find ourselves at the crossroads of history. We can retreat and watch our cause die with the winter, or we can strike where the enemy least expects us." He placed his finger on Princeton. the small college town that served as Cornwallis's base of operations. According to historical accounts from the National Park Service archives, Washington's plan was audacious in its simplicity and terrifying in its risk. They would leave their campfires burning and a small detachment making noise to convince the British. They remained in Trenton, while the main army executed a night march around Cornwallis's left flank to attack Princeton at dawn. Major General John Sullivan raised the concern that haunted every officer present. "Sir, if we fail in this attack, we'll be caught between Princeton's garrison and Cornwallis's main force. There will be no escape." The room fell silent as the implications sank in. This was not merely a tactical gamble, it was an all-or-nothing bet on the survival of the revolution itself. Washington's response would become legendary among his officers. He stood slowly, his imposing frame casting long shadows in the flickering candlelight. "The enemy thinks us beaten. Gentlemen, they believe we cower in Trenton like wounded animals waiting for the kill. But we are not animals, we are Americans, and we choose our own fate." As the officers dispersed to prepare their men, Washington remained alone with the map, tracing the route they would take through the darkness. The march would cover 10 miles of frozen roads, requiring absolute silence and perfect coordination. One mistake, one moment of carelessness, and Cornwallis would have them trapped like rats in a barrel. The general's thoughts turned to the men who would follow him into this desperate gamble. Many were farmers and tradesmen who had never seen battle before joining his army. Others were veterans of earlier defeats who had stayed when others fled. All of them deserved better than the impossible odds they faced. Yet all of them had chosen to remain when their enlistments expired, inspired by their recent victory at Trenton. As midnight approached, Washington made his final preparations. He penned a letter to Congress, sealed but not sent, explaining his actions should the morning bring disaster. The letter would either be burned in celebration or serve as his final testament to the cause of liberty. The die was cast. In a few hours, they would march into the darkness toward Princeton, carrying with them the hopes and dreams of a nation struggling to be born. The clock in Trenton's church tower chimed midnight as General Washington's Continental Army began their ghostly procession through the ice-crusted streets. Behind them, carefully maintained campfires flickered like dying stars, while a skeleton crew of volunteers continued the charade of normal camp activity to deceive British patrols. The real army, however, was melting into the New Jersey darkness like shadows fleeing the dawn. Captain Alexander Hamilton rode alongside Washington's column, his young face etched with concentration as he coordinated the complex movement of nearly 5,000 men through terrain that could betray them with a single misstep. The frozen ground rang like iron beneath their feet, each footfall threatening to echo across the winter landscape and alert enemy sentries to their desperate gambit. The march route took them along the back roads of Hunterdon County, posts known only to local farmers and hunters who had joined their cause. These New Jersey guides moved with the confidence of men defending their own soil, leading the Continental columns through creek beds and wooded ravines that would conceal their movement from British reconnaissance. Washington had divided his force into two main columns for the night march. General Sullivan commanded the River Road approach, while General Greene led the inland route through Quaker Bridge. This division served dual purposes. It reduced the risk of discovery and created multiple attack vectors against Princeton's defenses. The coordination required was staggering, with timing that had to be precise to the minute dot as they moved through the pre-dawn darkness. The bitter cold became their most relentless enemy. Soldiers wrapped their feet in strips of cloth torn from their own shirts, leaving trails of blood on the frozen ground. Many men suffered from frostbite, but none fell out of formation. They understood that their survival depended not on individual comfort, but on collective success. The silence was broken only by the whispered commands of sergeants and the occasional whimper of pain from men whose wounds from Trenton had not yet healed. Washington rode among his troops, offering quiet words of encouragement and sharing the hardships of the march. His presence alone seemed to warm the frozen air around him, reminding every soldier why they had chosen to follow this Virginia planter into hell itself. By 3 o'clock in the morning, advanced scouts reported that they had successfully bypassed Cornwallis's main camp without detection. The British general, confident that Washington was trapped in Trenton, had settled in for the night, planning his assault for dawn. He had no idea that his quarry was already miles away, preparing to strike at his vulnerable rear guard. The landscape began to change as they approached Princeton. Rolling farmland gave way to more structured settlements, and the spires of Nassau Hall, the college's main building, became visible against the star-filled sky. Local patriots had provided detailed intelligence about British positions, revealing that approximately 1,200 enemy soldiers occupied the town. Under the command of Lieutenant Colonel Charles Mawhood, Washington called a brief halt 2 miles from Princeton to make final preparations. Officers synchronized their pocket watches and reviewed the attack plan one last time. The assault would begin at sunrise, with Greene's column attacking from the north while Sullivan's force struck from the southwest. Speed and surprise would be their only advantages against disciplined British regulars. As the eastern horizon began to show the faintest hint of dawn, Captain William Washington, the general's cousin, approached with his cavalry unit. These mounted soldiers would play a crucial role in the coming battle, charging enemy positions and preventing organized retreat. Their horses' breath created small clouds in the frigid air, giving them an almost spectral appearance in the dim light. The army resumed its march toward Princeton, knowing that within hours they would either achieve a victory that could change the course of the war or face destruction that would end the American experiment forever. Every man understood the stakes, and every man was ready to pay the ultimate price for the chance at liberty. The fate of a nation now rested on what would happen in the next few hours on the fields around Princeton, New Jersey. The first rays of January 3rd sun painted the frost-covered fields around Princeton in shades of gold and crimson as General Washington's columns approached their final positions. Through the morning mist, the red brick buildings of the College of New Jersey stood like silent sentinels, while British sentries stamped their feet against the cold. Unaware that death was approaching through the dawn, Lieutenant Colonel Charles Mawhood had spent a restless night in Princeton, troubled by reports of unusual activity to the south. As commander of the British garrison, he bore responsibility for protecting Cornwallis's supply lines and maintaining communication with the main army. The colonel had received orders to march south that morning, with 2 regiments to reinforce Cornwallis's expected assault on Trenton, leaving only a skeleton force to guard the town. Washington's plan was unfolding with deadly precision. His intelligence network had informed him of Mawhood's planned departure, creating a perfect opportunity to strike the British while they were divided and vulnerable. As Greene's column moved into position north of the town, Sullivan's forces prepared to assault from the southwest, creating a deadly crossfire that would trap the enemy. Between converging American forces, the first shots of the Battle of Princeton rang out at approximately 8 o'clock in the morning, when Mawhood's advance guard encountered American scouts near the Quaker Meeting House. Captain John Fleming of the 17th Light Dragoons wheeled his horse around and raced back toward Princeton, shouting warnings that reverberated through the crisp morning air. The element of surprise was lost, but Washington's gamble was already in motion. Mawhood faced an agonizing decision that would determine the fate of his command. He could continue his march toward Cornwallis as ordered, leaving Princeton defenseless, or he could turn back to defend the town against what appeared to be a significant American force. The British colonel chose duty over discretion, ordering his regiments to wheel about and form battle lines on the high ground overlooking the town. The British 40th Foot Regiment deployed in textbook formation, their scarlet uniforms creating a crimson line against the white snow. These were professional soldiers who had served in campaigns across the globe, men trained to stand firm under fire and deliver devastating volleys with mechanical precision. Their disciplined ranks presented a formidable obstacle to Washington's advancing Americans. Captain Hamilton, serving as Washington's aide-de-camp, galloped between the converging columns with final orders and encouragement. The young officer's horse stumbled on the icy ground, nearly throwing him, but he recovered and continued his crucial mission of coordination. The success of the entire operation depended on precise timing and communication between widely separated forces. As the American columns closed on Princeton, individual acts of heroism began to emerge from the chaos of battle. Sergeant Joseph White of the 3rd Virginia Regiment spotted a British cannon crew preparing to fire grape shot into the advancing Americans. Without hesitation, he charged the position alone, bayonet fixed, and drove off the gunners before they could discharge their deadly load. The sound of musket fire echoed across the frozen landscape as Sullivan's men engaged British positions on the southern edge of town. The distinctive crack of American rifles mixed with the deeper boom of British smoothbore muskets, creating a deadly symphony that would determine the fate of the Revolution. Smoke began to drift across the battlefield, mixing with the morning mist to create an ethereal, nightmarish landscape. Washington himself rode forward to observe the developing battle, his blue and buff uniform making him a conspicuous target for British marksmen. His aides pleaded with him to remain in a safer position, but the general understood that his presence on the battlefield was worth more than tactical wisdom. His soldiers needed to see him sharing their dangers, leading from the front as he had at Trenton. The critical moment of the battle was approaching as Mawhood's regulars prepared to make their stand. The British colonel had positioned his men expertly, using the terrain to maximum advantage and maintaining interior lines that allowed rapid reinforcement of threatened positions. If his disciplined volleys could break the American assault, Cornwallis would arrive within hours to complete the destruction of Washington's army. But the Americans who approached Princeton that morning were no longer the same force that had fled across New Jersey just weeks earlier. They had tasted victory at Trenton, and they could smell it again in the cold morning air. The morning sun climbed higher as the Battle of Princeton reached its crescendo, transforming the peaceful college town into a cauldron of smoke, blood, and thunderous gunfire. British volleys crashed like waves against the advancing American lines. But General Washington's men pressed forward with a determination born of desperation and newfound confidence. Captain Thomas Rodney of the Delaware Militia later described the scene in his journal, noting how the disciplined British fire initially staggered the American advance. Red-coated regulars of the 40th Foot Regiment stood in perfect formation, delivering controlled volleys that should have shattered any colonial force. But these Americans had learned hard lessons in the months since their defeats around New York, and they no longer broke and ran at the first taste of British steel. The turning point came when Captain Alexander Hamilton personally directed the placement of American artillery pieces on the rising ground overlooking the British positions. The young officer, his uniform torn by musket balls, supervised the loading of grape shot that would sweep the enemy ranks like a deadly scythe. His mathematical precision in calculating angles and distances proved as valuable as any sword or musket in the unfolding battle. General Hugh Mercer, commanding a brigade of Continental troops, led a fierce assault against Mawhood's left flank near the stone bridge crossing Stony Brook. The Scottish-born physician-turned-soldier had served with Washington in the French and Indian War, and his tactical expertise was evident as he maneuvered his men through the broken terrain that surrounded Princeton. His advance threatened to cut off the British line of retreat toward New Brunswick. The British responded with characteristic professionalism, wheeling companies to meet each American thrust. While maintaining their defensive formation, Lieutenant Colonel Mawhood rode among his men, his sword flashing in the morning light as he directed the defense. The British commander understood that his small force must hold until Cornwallis could arrive with reinforcements, and he was prepared to sacrifice every man under his command to achieve that goal. But Washington had anticipated this British strategy, and his own tactical genius was becoming apparent as the battle developed. While Mercer pressed the British left and Sullivan assaulted their center, Greene's column emerged from the woods north of Princeton to strike in Mawhood's right flank and rear. The British suddenly found themselves fighting on three sides, their interior lines becoming a trap rather than an advantage. The college students of Princeton, many of whom had fled when the British occupied their campus, watched from hidden vantage points as their homeland became a battlefield. Nassau Hall, the imposing stone structure that housed the college's main facilities, stood between the combatants like a silent witness to history. British soldiers had been using the building as a barracks, never imagining that American artillery would soon be aimed at its walls. Private Joseph Clark of New Jersey, fighting in his first major battle, found himself face to face with a British grenadier near the college chapel. The two men charged each other with bayonets fixed, and their desperate struggle epitomized the larger conflict raging around them. Clark's determination to defend his native soil proved stronger than his opponent's professional training, and the British soldier fell with Clark's blade between his ribs. As the American pressure intensified, cracks began to appear in the British defense. Individual soldiers started glancing nervously toward their line of retreat, and sergeants had to use harsh words to maintain discipline in the ranks. The psychological impact of being outnumbered and surrounded was taking its toll on men who had been trained to fight conventional European battles, not this desperate American style of warfare. Washington rode along his lines, his presence electrifying every soldier who saw him. The general's uniform was singed by musket fire, and his horse had been wounded by a British sword thrust. But he continued to direct the battle with calm authority. Officers and enlisted men alike drew strength from his example, knowing that their commander was sharing every danger they faced. The British position was becoming untenable, but Mahood's regulars continued to fight with desperate courage. These professional soldiers understood that retreat might mean the destruction of their entire force, while a continued defense might allow enough time for Cornwallis to arrive and reverse the tide of battle. The next few moments would determine whether Princeton became an American victory or a British rallying point that could destroy Washington's army forever. The crack of splintering would echo across the Princeton battlefield as American artillery, under Captain Hamilton's precise direction, found its mark against British defensive positions. Nassau Hall's stately walls bore fresh scars from cannon shot, and the morning air filled with the acrid smoke of gunpowder, mixed with the metallic scent of blood on snow. General Hugh Mercer's assault on the British left flank had reached its critical moment when disaster struck the American advance. A British volley caught Mercer's horse, sending both rider and mount crashing to the frozen ground. Before the general could regain his feet, British bayonets were upon him. Lieutenant Colonel Mahood himself led the countercharge that left Mercer mortally wounded, his life's blood seeping into the New Jersey soil he had fought to defend. The sight of their beloved commander falling sent shockwaves through Mercer's brigade. These Continental soldiers, many of whom had followed the Scottish general through previous campaigns, began to waver under the renewed British pressure. For a terrifying moment, it appeared that the entire American left flank might collapse, exposing Washington's army to the very destruction they had marched through the night to avoid. But Captain John Fleming of the Philadelphia militia stepped into the breach left by Mercer's fall. The 24-year-old officer, his uniform already torn by British musket fire, rallied the scattered troops with words that would be remembered long after the battle. "Boys, we came here to win liberty, or die trying. General Mercer showed us how to die, now let's show these redcoats how Americans can live." Fleming's charge into the British bayonets inspired a renewed American assault that caught Mahood's regulars at their moment of triumph. The British colonel, who had just moments before tasted victory, now found his position crumbling as fresh American troops poured into the gap. The psychological momentum of battle, that invisible force that often determines outcomes more than tactics or numbers, was shifting decisively toward Washington's favor. Captain William Washington, the general's cousin, led his cavalry in a sweeping charge that struck the British right flank just as Greene's infantry emerged from the woods. In perfect coordination, the British found themselves caught in a deadly crossfire, with American forces converging from three directions, while their own line of retreat toward New Brunswick grew increasingly precarious. The fighting around Nassau Hall reached savage intensity as British soldiers, using the college buildings as makeshift fortifications, made their final stand. American militiamen, many fighting to defend their own neighborhoods, showed no mercy to the foreign soldiers who had occupied their homeland. Room-to-room fighting raged through the academic halls where young men had once debated philosophy and mathematics. Lieutenant Colonel Mahood, recognizing that his position was hopeless, made the agonizing decision to order a general retreat. The British commander had fought with distinction, but he could not overcome the mathematical reality of being outnumbered 3-1 by an enemy fighting on their home ground. His professional soldiers began their withdrawal in good order, but the retreat quickly degenerated into a rout as American pressure intensified. Washington himself appeared at the crucial moment, his imposing figure on horseback clearly visible through the battle smoke. The general's presence on the front lines, sharing the dangers of his common soldiers, inspired a final surge of American energy that swept the British resistance away. Like a winter flood, his blue and buff uniform, now stained with powder smoke and blood, had become a symbol of American determination. The pursuit of the retreating British forces continued for several miles along the road toward New Brunswick. American cavalry harassed the enemy rear guard while infantry columns pressed forward to prevent any reorganization of the British line. Prisoners were taken by the hundreds and valuable military supplies fell into American hands, including artillery pieces that would strengthen Washington's growing army. As the sounds of battle faded into the distance, Washington surveyed the field where American independence had been secured through blood and courage. The college town of Princeton, which had awakened that morning under British occupation, was now firmly in American hands. More importantly, the psychological impact of this victory would resonate far beyond the frozen fields of New Jersey. The impossible had been achieved, but Washington knew that Cornwallis would soon arrive with overwhelming force. The Americans had won the battle, but the larger struggle for survival was just beginning. The smoke of battle still drifted across Princeton's snow-covered streets as General Washington surveyed the field where American independence had been. Purchased with blood and determination, British resistance had crumbled, their professional soldiers fleeing toward New Brunswick in disorder. But the full magnitude of what had been accomplished was only beginning to dawn on the victorious Americans. Captain Alexander Hamilton approached his commander with preliminary casualty reports, his youthful face grave with the weight of loss. The Americans had suffered relatively light casualties, fewer than 40 killed and wounded, while British losses exceeded 400, including nearly 300 prisoners who would not return to fight against the Continental Army. But among the American dead lay General Hugh Mercer, whose sacrifice had helped secure the victory. Washington dismounted near Nassau Hall, where British soldiers had made their final stand. The college building, its walls scarred by American artillery, stood as a monument to the struggle that had transformed a colonial rebellion into a war for independence. Students and faculty who had fled the British occupation began emerging from their hiding places, their faces reflecting amazement that their little college town had become the stage for such a momentous victory. The strategic implications of Princeton extended far beyond the immediate battlefield. Cornwallis, arriving with his main force just hours after the fighting ended, found only empty positions and the bitter knowledge that Washington had outmaneuvered him completely. The British general's confidence in crushing the American rebellion had been shattered by a colonial army that refused to behave according to European military conventions. News of the Princeton victory spread through the colonies like wildfire, carried by riders who understood they bore tidings that could reshape the war's trajectory. In Philadelphia, delegates to the Continental Congress received word of Washington's triumph with prayers of thanksgiving and renewed determination to support the military effort. The victory breathed life into a cause that had seemed destined for defeat just days earlier. International reactions to Princeton would prove equally significant in the months that followed. European observers, particularly in France and Spain, began to reassess their evaluation of American military capabilities. The victory demonstrated that Washington's army could not only survive British attacks, but could also take the offensive and defeat regular troops in open battle. This shift in perception would eventually lead to the foreign alliances that made American independence possible. The psychological impact on both armies was immediate and profound. British morale, which had soared after their victories around New York, now plummeted as soldiers realized they faced an enemy who could strike anywhere at any time. American confidence, conversely, reached new heights as word spread that their Continental Army had defeated the world's most professional military force in consecutive battles. Washington understood that Princeton represented more than a tactical victory. It was proof that American independence was achievable through military means. The general, who had led his army across the Delaware on Christmas night, had demonstrated strategic genius that would be studied by military historians for generations. His willingness to risk everything on a single bold stroke had transformed the revolution from a dying cause into a viable struggle for liberty. The prisoners taken at Princeton provided valuable intelligence about British plans and dispositions, while captured military supplies helped address the Continental Army's chronic shortages. More importantly, the victory attracted new recruits to Washington's cause, as young men throughout the colonies were inspired by news that Americans could defeat the mighty British Empire in battle. As Washington prepared to move his army into winter quarters at Morristown, he reflected on how completely the situation had changed since that desperate night crossing of the Delaware. The army that had seemed on the verge of dissolution was now confident and growing in strength. The revolution that had appeared doomed was now attracting international attention and support. The Battle of Princeton had indeed meant the difference between victory and defeat for the American cause. In 10 days of campaigning, Washington had transformed a collapsing rebellion into a war of independence that would ultimately succeed. The frozen fields around a small New Jersey college town had become the birthplace of a nation, where courage and determination had triumphed over professional military might. The echo of those musket volleys would resonate through history, inspiring future generations who faced their own struggles for freedom and self-determination. Princeton had proven that ordinary people, fighting for their homeland and their principles, could defeat any enemy and achieve any goal they were willing to pay for with their blood and sacrifice.